Our guest speaker today is Max Blumenthal. Max Blumenthal, as many of you know, is a journalist and a writer. He's a published author of books including Goliath and the 51-Day War and the Management of Savagery and others. He's a documentary filmmaker. He produced Killing Gaza, a documentary about the 2014 war in Gaza, and he's the executive editor of the Grayzone News. Max, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good to see you, Amar. And thanks everyone for being here. Thanks to Marty for helping organize this. It's such an important event about a speech that is completely overlooked by mainstream American historians and the US media, and for reasons that are pretty clear to me. John F. Kennedy's so-called peace speech, for all its flaws, and I'll touch on a few of them, was one of the most dovish and probably subversive speeches ever delivered by a US president. And despite being one of the most consequential at the time, as he pushed for a nuclear test ban and negotiations to avert total annihilation, the speech was studiously ignored by US media, while Soviet media broadcast this speech profusely for Soviet citizens to warm their attitudes up toward negotiations with the United States, and a very positive effect. Kennedy declared in his address that we are all mortal, and he would soon demonstrate that in a horrific way. And I believe strongly that the reception of this speech by the national security elite of JFK's day and his assassination are inextricably related. Today, too, JFK's words would be treated as absolute heresy in Washington. He would be denounced as a Russian puppet for what he said. It would be considered heresy in Washington, where I sit today, to declare as he did that no government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. And it would be considered heresy to declare, as JFK did, that if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. What did he mean by diversity? Kennedy didn't mean diversity in the sense that the professional managerial class that holds diversity workshops inside corporations like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon do. He meant diversity in the world of international relations, respecting diverse cultures and histories that demand political systems that are different from the liberal democracy that the United States uses to project its soft and its hard power as the basis for its projection as a shining city on the hill, and to impose that system on other countries. Kennedy's speech was a rebuke of the rollback policy pushed during his time by the Joint Chiefs, who wanted to bombard Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis rather than negotiate an end to the standoff, and of the regime change insanity that is pushed today by leaders of both the Democratic and Republican Party behind the guise of democracy promotion. There could have been no stronger rebuke to the prevailing mentality of both parties to the outside world. And it's because of that mentality, which I'll focus my speech on, or my remarks on, that we're in a period that is arguably more dangerous than the first Cold War, because we live under a regime dominated by the influence of an arrogant national security elite that mocks the notion of nuclear retaliation from Russia while it mulls first strike attacks on Moscow via its Ukrainian proxy. And where this same national security elite surveys the wreckage it brought to the Arab Middle East and then proceeds to intensify the aerial bridge of heavy weapons that it ships to Israel to carpet bomb the besieged Gaza Strip, to assail southern Lebanon, attack Yemen, conduct assassinations inside Iran, and drag the region closer to total war. The unprecedented danger of this scenario is not only the result of the absence of a Brahmin-like charismatic JFK figure who would be willing to confront the national security state and turn back the doomsday clock. It's really the result of the absence of the conditions that produced the JFK who appeared at American University in June 1963 to deliver that peace speech. Our national security elites still exist in the delusional haze of the period of high unipolarity that prevailed after the end of the first Cold War. And it therefore has no fear, as Kennedy did, of mortality or the kind of mass death brought by a total nuclear war. It doesn't even fear real consequences for the belligerent actions it has been carrying out since the end of the Cold War, which this national security elite, helmed at the time by longtime CIA director George H.W. Bush, arrogantly and falsely declared as a U.S. victory, rather than a triumph alongside the Soviet Union for peace, for diplomacy, without total war. And so they set the stage for a second Cold War with this narrative. The narrative included the sense that the US had defeated the Soviet Union through the largest CIA operation in history, Operation Cyclone, conducted in Afghanistan, which saw the CIA pump $1.5 billion into the Afghan Mujahideen, working with the British MI6 and the Saudi monarchy, which put up a matching fund to bring foreign fighters to the battlefield, who included a network of Wahhabi fanatics who based themselves across the border in Peshawar and then set up a base in Khost in Afghanistan, which became the inspiration for the name of the organization that they founded after the Red Army retreated from Afghanistan. They called it Al-Qaeda, which simply means the base. Their financier was Osama bin Laden, who returned as a hero to Saudi Arabia, which then promptly hosted American troops and forged a special alliance with the United States. Of course, this set the stage for incredible blowback. It was a time of the 1990s when everyone basked in, I remember these times during the Clinton era, we basked in what we thought was peace and prosperity. And the national security elite, which was comfortable under a figure like Bill Clinton, who had done the CIA's bidding by, for example, allowing it to use airfields in Mena, Arkansas, to ship drugs to and from Central America, along with bags of cash, and during which they adopted the Wolfowitz Doctrine, a doctrine composed by a young neoconservative staffer in George H.W. Bush's Pentagon, which preached that any challenge to the U.S. system and U.S. hegemony must be crushed with absolute force and violence, and that the diversity in international relations that Kennedy yearned for should be rejected. The Wolfowitz Doctrine was the guiding light for all administrations after the end of the Cold War. And it informed the regime change wars that Bill Clinton presided over in the former Yugoslavia, transforming a formerly stable, diverse, and prosperous socialist country into a series of balkanized right-wing republics, including Kosovo, run by the Al-Qaeda-tied, drug and narco-infested KLA, which received backing from the CIA and MI6. Clinton set about laying the groundwork for the Iraq War with the Iraq Liberation Act in Congress, funding kind of mujahideen in Iraq with federal money and sanctioning Iraq into oblivion, leaving, according to Madeleine Albright herself, hundreds of thousands of children dead. 9/11 as was the blowback for the covert operations that the US waged in Afghanistan to, in its view, end the Cold War, and all the way to the completion of the Day of the Plains operation waged by Al-Qaeda operatives. A rogue unit within the CIA known as Alex Station ran cover for two key figures who would become hijackers on 9/11, who were also being ferried around the United States and sponsored by Saudi intelligence with the full knowledge of this rogue unit. Their names were Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, and they both helped fly a plane into the US Pentagon. And they were CIA recruits, as we now know. The CIA refused to tell the FBI's bin Laden unit about their presence or even to open a criminal investigation. And the members of that Alex Station have since been promoted and even inspired protagonists for Hollywood blockbuster films like Zero Dark 30. John F. Kennedy in his peace speech declared that the United States will never start a war. The Bush administration, the second Bush administration, which brought neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz back into the building, turned that on its head when they attacked Iraq as punishment for an attack on the United States that Iraq had nothing to do with. Why did we attack Iraq? It was simple. As Michael Ledeen, the neoconservative, said in his, spelled out in his Ledeen doctrine, which was also articulated by the liberal columnist, neoliberal columnist Thomas Friedman during a Charlie Rose interview. The United States simply had to go somewhere in the Arab world, throw Arabs against the wall and scare them and tell them, suck on this, in the words of Thomas Friedman. This straightforward, racist logic defied the guidance and wise counsel of JFK in his peace speech to respect the people and cultures, even of countries that the United States government considers adversaries. And it led not only to the maiming and deaths of thousands of American citizens, but to the rise of ISIS, one of the most fanatical nihilistic forces to rise in the Middle East since the foundation of Israel. The so-called Arab Spring, which erupted during the Obama administration, became cover for the West and its theocratic Gulf partners to destroy the remnants of Arab nationalism which challenged Israel. First, they moved in on Gaddafi, because unlike Fidel Castro, who invited Soviet missiles onto Cuban territory as a deterrent against an inevitable US invasion, and who guaranteed his survival under the Soviet protective umbrella, Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program in exchange for promises from the West for economic normalization. Trusting his Western partners proved to be fatal. And as soon as they flooded his country with weapons under the guise of a non-existent peaceful rebellion against his strong man rule, he was powerless to prevent anything. He was powerless to deter the West. The weapons wound up immediately in the hands of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was being run by the MI6 and French intelligence, and which was a longtime Al-Qaeda affiliate. And towards the end, Gaddafi found himself on the phone with Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, who helped oversee the normalization deal between Libya and the West. And he told Blair that if he was overthrown, not only would the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group take over, but an ISIS-like entity would establish a caliphate within Libyan territory. Africa would be flooded with Libyan weapons and large swaths of the continent would be destabilized. And Europe would be flooded with migrants from the African continent. After Gaddafi was sodomized and bayoneted to death by Al-Qaeda affiliates operating directly under NATO air cover, his darkest prophecies came true. And worse, a young man who was brought by the MI6 from a cell it was running in Manchester, England, to fight Gaddafi, Salam Abedi, and who was returned to the UK on a Royal Navy ship, carried out the worst terrorist attack on British soil in history, slaughtering girls at an Ariana Grande concert in 2016. Today, Libyan arms have destabilized Africa, leading to attacks in Mali just yesterday in Bamako and Burkina Faso, where popular coups to remove the French security forces that have allowed these attacks to take place for years and which participated directly in the Libyan regime change operation have taken place. The next on the chopping block for the national security elite, the regime change hungry national security elite, was Syria. And Syria was directly connected to Libya through Benghazi, where a US ambassador named Christopher Stevens had traveled to a US consulate to help manage arms shipments from Libyan military depots to the so-called Syrian rebels, the Free Syrian Army being run by the CIA, and where he was killed in that consulate by the jihadist mobs that Gaddafi had warned about. Another case of blowback. The CIA-backed Free Syrian Army promptly became a weapons farm for al-Qaeda's local affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, and the ISIS bandits, who arose out of the destruction of Iraq and spread across the border, and whose advance, as admitted by former Secretary of State John Kerry, was managed by Washington and London. And it was only thanks to an intervention by Russia and Iran, our designated enemies, beginning in 2015, that the forces of al-Qaeda were defeated and Syrians, average Syrians, in places like Damascus and Aleppo, could live free of perpetual terror. But in the eyes of the US national security state, the sacrifice of tens of thousands of Syrian soldiers and the contributions of Russia and Iran to defeat the organization responsible for the 9/11 attacks, which threatened to overrun Lebanon as well, was a great crime which had to be avenged, which is why Donald Trump authorized the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general who oversaw the defeat of ISIS and al-Qaeda in large parts of Syria. The destabilization of Syria and destruction of Libya and Iraq were accompanied by a series of migrant crises, which triggered the rise of right-wing parties in Europe, Brexit, and the gradual collapse of the European Union. These were all consequences of Washington's refusal to recognize the right of other political systems to exist anywhere in the world. So today, swaths of Syria lay in ruins, and in the areas formerly controlled by ISIS in northeastern Syria, where ISIS stole oil and sold it on the black market, ISIS has been conveniently replaced by the US military and its Kurdish proxies, which steal Syria's oil and sell it on the black market just as ISIS did. It's a criminal pirate occupation regime whose existence is still unknown by most Americans following horse race politics. The Palestinians, though they had nothing to do with 9/11, were blamed not only for celebrating 9/11, but for interfering with Pax Americana and the state that former Secretary of State Alexander Haig called America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. That's Israel. When the Bush administration demanded democracy for the Palestinians in 2005 as part of its democracy promotion agenda, it was forced to reject the results. When Palestinians voted for Hamas, a less corrupt alternative to the ossified Fatah party and its Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza, Hamas pledged to resist the perpetual occupiers while the Palestinian Authority functioned as a kind of Vichy regime, assisting and collaborating with the occupation. Gaza was placed under siege from 2006 on. The Palestinian residents of Gaza were punished and the US refused all of the end treaties and appeals by Hamas for negotiations along 1967 lines, including a 40-year hudna or ceasefire with Israel, treating it instead as a terrorist group that could only be overthrown through force, supporting every brutal Israeli assault on its territory, every Israeli assassination of its leadership, seeking a peace only between the wealthy Gulf states, the least democratic governments on the planet, and Israel through the Abraham Accords, without the Palestinian assent, without the Palestinians' consent, seeking to place their struggle in the historical icebox. And you can draw a straight line between this attitude, this obsession with regime change anywhere a different system arises, and the October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel. Hamas's leader, Yahya Sinwar, has explicitly drawn this link. Today, the US adopts the Israeli plan of eradicating Hamas, a plan which rejects Kennedy's wisdom, which calls for respecting people even under governments that are seen as adversaries. It's a mentality that has made genocide inevitable because Hamas controls a mass popular base in Gaza and oversaw a civilian government, which I've witnessed in action through multiple trips to Gaza. Today, any Palestinian who maintained any connection to that government, whether as a janitor in a government facility, a hospital administrator, a municipal worker, or a police officer who is helping to stop drug smuggling or to allow aid shipments to reach people in Gaza without being looted, they are all targets of Israel's dystopian AI assassination system, and they are killed nightly in their beds along with their entire families. This genocide is the product of the regime change mentality, which is dominant among the US national security elite. JFK in his time dealt with an Israel lobby, and there are many theories around his assassination seeking to connect Israel to it. Can't really comment on those. One thing is for certain, I don't think JFK could have ever imagined the control that the Israel lobby exerts over US politics, and I doubt that someone like him would have bowed to it the way that Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and Donald Trump have. Because the US national security regime and because the political class in the Beltway, which exists under the sway of AIPAC, the main arm of the Israel lobby, is unable to or refuses to draw a red line on Israeli savagery in the Gaza Strip. This conflict over a tiny slice of territory, which could have easily been resolved with a simple phone call and a threat of an arms embargo to Israel, demanding the return of Israeli hostages and prisoners of war in exchange for Palestinian prisoners who are essentially held hostage in Israel's torture dungeons. Instead of that, the Biden administration has been willing to allow this conflict to spiral into a regional conflagration. And the horror that we witnessed in Lebanon over the past 2 days through Israel's mass battery attacks, attacking thousands of people through their cell phones and radios, is a mere preview of the horror and bloodshed that Israel will produce under the watch of an American patron that sometimes seems like a client. We also stand as we await a possible Hezbollah and Iranian counterattack on Israel at the precipice of direct war with Russia. Now, let's go back to Kennedy's speech for a second and consider some words that he dismissed as a Soviet conspiracy that he heard in Soviet media at the time. American imperialist circles are preparing to unleash different types of wars. There is a very real threat of a preventative war being unleashed by American imperialists against the Soviet Union. and that the political aims of American imperialists are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries, and to achieve world domination by means of aggressive wars. That bulletin, or that commentary that Kennedy dismissed as conspiracy, perfectly describes and encapsulates what the US has been doing since the end of the Cold War, what it seeks to do, particularly vis-a-vis Ukraine, to Russia, starting with when the US enacted the Maidan coup during the Obama administration. Now, Kennedy urged diplomats to be instructed to avoid unnecessary irritants and purely rhetorical hostility in his peace speech. And Victoria Nuland is the living antithesis to those words. Victoria Nuland, the former chief of staff to Dick Cheney, who emerged in the Obama administration, also wife of neoconservative Robert Kagan, who helped write the doctrine of benevolent hegemony that forms the lodestar of neoconservatism. Victoria Nuland rose to Assistant Secretary of State for for Eastern European affairs under Obama, and handed out cookies to Maidan protesters and rioters as she hand-selected the new government that would come into power after the elected government, which had pledged aggressive neutrality between Russia and the West, was ousted. And as John Mearsheimer said, by enacting, orchestrating, and celebrating the Maidan coup, the United States set Ukraine on the primrose path to war. The Minsk Accords were viciously abused by the United States and its Western partners, its European vassals. As Angela Merkel said, the Minsk Accords were merely used by the West to buy time to arm Ukraine, to place heavy weapons on Russian borders, and to prepare Ukraine for an inevitable war. They were never a means of actually negotiating with Russia, as JFK did to support a test ban. Following the Maidan coup, Hillary Clinton was to have been elected, promising continuity, a no-fly zone over Syria, which would have brought the US into direct conflict with Russia, and the aggressive attack on Putin's Russia. But that, for some reason, didn't happen. Something went wrong. Donald Trump, a rogue president, came into power and shattered the continuity that had prevailed in every post-Cold War administration on US foreign policy. Something you are simply not allowed to do in Washington. He was no JFK, not an inspiring figure, not even an admirable figure in my view. But he was willing to sit down and negotiate with Vladimir Putin without spouting hostile rhetoric. He was even willing to sit down with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, and attempt to negotiate a peace on the Korean Peninsula, an end to the war that the United States started and the artificial division imposed by the United States and the US military occupation on the Korean Peninsula that 80% of South Koreans favored. Donald Trump was not a man of peace. He was simply an unpredictable figure who wanted to make a deal with other strong figures. And this was unacceptable to the national security elite who collaborated with the Hillary Clinton dead-enders to gin up Russiagate, the national security hoax that led to attacks on Donald Trump that were unprecedented for a president in my lifetime, and culminated with former CIA director John Brennan calling Donald Trump on national TV a traitor, accusing him of treason, a crime for which the penalty is death. So today is the anniversary of the death of the person I consider the last Russian scholar in the United States, the last true Russian scholar, who actually was able to get on national TV and get traction. It was Stephen Cohen, who became a friend of mine later in his life. Stephen Cohen's writings are essential today, especially his last book, War with Russia, but also his book on Soviet fates, in which he argued that the Soviet Union could have been reformed instead of subjected to a piece of the slave, as Kennedy said, in the 1990s when its economy was looted by neoliberal economists under the watch of Larry Summers, and which fueled the rise of Vladimir Putin. Stephen Cohen was prophetic in this way. Stephen Cohen referred to Russiagate as Intelgate and understood that this was about much more than embarrassing and bringing down Donald Trump, and that it involved intelligence operatives who would wiretap Donald Trump, who were inserted into his campaign, Stepan Halper being one, who were responsible for the Steele dossier, a dodgy dossier filled with falsehoods and smears, first paid for by the Clinton campaign, which was then passed on to the FBI as the basis for FISA warrants against members of Trump's team. Something, again, I think was unprecedented in my lifetime. Donald Trump's impeachment, his first impeachment, was also due to Intelgate, in which a fake whistleblower from the national security elite revealed that Donald Trump was seeking information on the corruption of Hunter Biden and the Biden family, which we all know now to not be a Russian plot, but to be all too true. And that Donald Trump was using U.S. military aid to Ukraine as leverage, that he was holding up the offensive weaponry, the Javelin missiles, that Obama had refused to give because it was a clear violation of the Minsk Accords. And through this impeachment, Donald Trump was neutered, and Donald Trump's attempts to negotiate with Vladimir Putin boomeranged and resulted in the withdrawal of the United States from the International Nuclear Forces Treaty, as well as other acts of hostility towards Russia. When Trump returned to the scene to run again, in this campaign, he was met with lawfare attacks wrapped up in the courts. Yet that failed to stop Donald Trump, as so many had predicted, including the district attorney, Alvin Green, who had pledged when he ran for office to stop Donald Trump from becoming president. It failed. And when it failed, Donald Trump mysteriously began to face assassination attempts. Do I know that these assassination attempts were guided by the national security elite? No, I don't. I have no evidence or basis for saying that. But you can forgive people who are conspiratorial for drawing those kinds of conclusions, particularly given the timing. Matthew Thomas Crooks was the first shooter. His identity remains shrouded in mystery. He seems like a lone wolf, an incel. He has no social media history, unlike almost everyone of his generation. And while we know nothing about Matthew Thomas Crooks or his motives, and he may have purely been a nihilist, we have to consider what might have happened if he had aimed 1 millimeter to the right of Donald Trump's ear. Nikki Haley, the national security state's choice for the Republican nomination, would have seized control of the Republican Party and its presidential nomination. And she may have defeated either Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. So even if Chapman acted purely alone with no clear political motivation, his success would have ratified assassination as an effective strategy for maintaining presidential continuity on foreign policy in the eyes of the national security elite, just as it did with the CIA-influenced plot to kill South Vietnam's Diem, who was collaborating with Kennedy to withdraw a number of U.S. troops from South Vietnam, and with the killing of JFK itself, who was replaced with a more pliant Lyndon B. Johnson, who rolled over for the Pentagon at every turn, ensuring that the war on Vietnam would escalate. The second Trump would-be assassin is named Ryan Ralph. He is a career criminal, a drifter with major gun charges, who was arrested after an armed standoff in 2002, who had fallen under FBI investigation, under repeated occasions, but still managed to get himself to Ukraine, to Kiev, to set himself up as a leader of the International Legion, recruiting troops, soldiers, mercenaries, and activists to support the US proxy war in Ukraine. And it was there in Kiev where Ryan Routh was radicalized, and where he pledged publicly in interviews to the New York Times, for example, and Semaphore, to smuggle Afghan fighters into Ukraine through illegal passports. In his 291-page book-length manifesto, which is still on Amazon, Ryan Routh called for Putin's assassination and fantasized about the assassination of Donald Trump. Despite this criminal background and his activities in Ukraine, or perhaps because of them, Ryan Routh was able to return to the United States, a free man, unmolested by any FBI or security agents. And he somehow was able to obtain Donald Trump's schedule and post up at a hole in the wall of Donald Trump's personal golf course, 300 meters from where the president stood, with a AK-47 style rifle and a sniper scope. How did Ryan Routh obtain Donald Trump's schedule? Was it from one of the many Beltway media contacts that he gathered while in Kiev? Or was it through an inside source? Was he groomed in some way by the national security state, urged to act as so many mentally troubled Muslim men were by the FBI during the so-called war on terror? Or was he put up to it by the Ukrainian regime, which has assassinated its own internal opponents while maintaining a government-sponsored kill list, Mirot Vorets, featuring many of my own American colleagues? We may never know the answer to these questions, but they remain salient at this point. And whatever the truth was about Ryan Routh, his exploits were a warning to any US politician who might consider breaking from the consensus on Ukraine, on shipping billions and billions of dollars of weapons from the American taxpayer to the battlefield to drive a war with Russia, which could soon turn into a direct war between the US and Russia, with the US and UK using satellite guidance to greenlight and authorize targets for long-range missile strikes in and around Moscow. Similarly, Israel's brazen assassinations of, for example, Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, someone who had no operational involvement in the October 7th attack, in a hotel room in Tehran following the inauguration of a new Iranian president, or the exploding battery attack, which has infused the whole of Iranian society with terror and panic and paranoia, while mangling thousands of people and killing several children and nurses. This sends a chilling message to any US politician considering upending the US-Israeli special relationship. Make no mistake, Israel's assassination machine is ruthless, it knows no borders, and it will remove any potential threat to its ethno-supremacist imperatives. We are living in an era more dangerous than the first Cold War, in my opinion, and it might be because I've lived so much of my life in this era and not the first Cold War. I didn't have to hide under my desk as my parents did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I believe we're living under a regime that hides behind the mask of liberal democracy, but which is controlled by an anti-democratic elite, which will use any and all means at its disposal, from censorship to lawfare to violence, and all means of subterfuge, to impose on us, the people of America, what Kennedy called the security of the slave. It will continue on this destructive path until it learns that there are consequences. When its mandarins are forced to recognize that they too are mortal, just as Kennedy did under imminent nuclear threat from a powerful Soviet Union. So let us redouble Kennedy's call for respect, increase contact, and communication between Americans and the people living under other political systems which suit their history and cultures, who are living under US sanctions, siege, and constant threat of regime change wars. Let's be ambassadors for peace. And let's be clear about who our real enemies are. They're not in Moscow, Beijing, Beirut, or Tehran. They're right here. There are leaders acting outside the bounds of international law while depriving us and future generations of the right to a healthy existence. Under their rule, the weak are not safe, and the strong are not just. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max.